Why do people carry the failures they experience not only as a burden belonging solely to themselves, but over time as a legacy that spreads into their families? While some generations can access money so easily, others are drowning in the pit of poverty. But what if there are weaknesses, addictions, betrayal, and poverty in your ancestry? Does this make you someone who has lost from the start, or does it transform into a hidden power that drives you to build a great fortune? What is the truth hidden in those dark streets where John D. Rockefeller was born? And what will change in your life when you learn this information? In the early 1900s, as Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie entered a race to become the world's richest person, an unexpected rivalry also emerged between France and Germany. Both sides claimed that Rockefeller's origins traced back to their own lands. Various genealogy experts were ready to manufacture a magnificent royal lineage for the oil baron for a large fee. However, Rockefeller clearly stated, "I have no desire to trace my lineage to nobility. I am more than satisfied with my simple and old American origins." The most ambitious Rockefeller ancestry research traced them to a 9th century French family, the Rockefeller, who allegedly lived in a Languedoc chateau. But this fascinating story was unfortunately refuted by recent findings. In contrast, the German origins of the Rockefeller family can be clearly traced in the Rhine Valley, dating back to at least the early 1600s. Around 1723, Miller Johann Peter Rockefeller gathered his wife and 5 children, sailed to Philadelphia, and settled on a farm first in Somerville, then in Amwell, New Jersey, where he clearly prospered and acquired large lands. More than a decade later, Diehl Rockefeller, from a distant branch of the family, left southwest Germany and settled in Germantown, New York. Diehl's granddaughter Christina married a distant relative, William, one of Johann's grandsons. Although John D. Rockefeller was not particularly emotionally attached to his European ancestors, he erected a monument to ancestor Johann Peter at his gravesite in Flemington, New Jersey. From William and Christina's marriage, Godfrey Rockefeller was born. He would become the future oil emperor's grandfather and be considered one of the family's most unexpected ancestors. In 1806, Godfrey married Lucy Avery in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, despite serious concerns from his family. As in an example that Rockefeller's mother would later repeat, Lucy had made what was considered a marriage beneath her, according to her family's condescending view. Her ancestors had migrated from Devon, England, to Salem, Massachusetts around 1630, forming part of the Puritan wave. The versatile Avery family, who settled over time and strengthened their social position, produced clergymen, soldiers, civic leaders, explorers, and merchants, to the extent including brave Indian warriors. During the American Revolution, 11 Averys died gloriously in the Battle of Groton. Although the noble origins of the Rockefeller family require a degree of poetic narrative and liberal embellishment, Lucy could reasonably claim descent from a line extending to English King Edmund Ironside, who ascended to the throne in 1016. Godfrey Rockefeller was unfortunately incompatible with his enterprising wife. Short in stature, presenting an impoverished appearance and carrying a shadow of defeat that never lifted, Lucy, a fiery Baptist with a dominant presence who was taller than her husband, was bony and self-assured with a strong stride and alert blue eyes. Having been a teacher in the past, Lucy had received a better education compared to Godfrey. Even John D., who didn't make bad comments about relatives, politely acknowledged, "My grandmother was a brave woman. Her husband was not as brave as she was." Godfrey Rockefeller had bequeathed to the family bluish-gray eyes and light brown hair. Lucy, on the other hand, had imparted the tall stature that would attract attention among men in later years. Enjoying robust energy and cheerful health, Lucy had 10 children, the third being William Avery Rockefeller, born in 1810 in Granger, New York. It's quite easy to determine the birth date of Rockefeller's father. However, weary teams of journalists attempting to uncover his death date will one day be exhausted in this quest. Even today, still not much more than a crossroads, Richford was then a stagecoach stop in a wooded region southeast of Ithaca and northwest of Binghamton. The original inhabitants of the region, the Iroquois, were driven out after the American Revolution and replaced by Revolutionary Army veterans. This provincial place, still a rough frontier region when the Rockefellers arrived, had recently gained township status, its village square dating from 1821. Civilization had barely gained a foothold. The dense forests everywhere were full of game animals: bear, deer, panther, wild turkey, and cottontail rabbit. People carried flaming torches at night to frighten away the roaming wolf packs. When John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839, Richford was acquiring the amenities of a small town. There were some beginning industries, lumber mills, grist mills, and a whiskey distillery, plus a schoolhouse and a church. Most residents made their living from stony farming, but these newcomers were hopeful and enterprising. Despite their frontier appearance, they had carried with them the frugal culture of Puritan New England, and John D. Rockefeller would become the symbols of this culture. The Rockefellers' steep property provided a sweeping panorama of a fertile valley. The spring slopes were speckled with wildflowers and chestnuts, and fruits were abundant in the fall. Amid this forest beauty, the Rockefellers had to struggle with a Spartan life. They occupied a small plain house, 22 feet deep and 16 feet wide, made with hand-hewn beams and timber. The thin soil was so rocky that heroic efforts were required to clear an opening through the dense forested slopes of pine, fir, oak, and maple, and among the bushes. From the few anecdotes we have, we can say that Lucy managed both the family and the farm competently and never avoided heavy work. With the help of a pair of oxen, she built an entire stone wall by herself. John D. took pleasure in telling how she pounced on a thief one night in the dark barn. Unable to distinguish the thief's face, she had enough mental composure to cut a piece of fabric from his coat sleeve. When she later noticed the man's worn coat, she confronted the astonished thief with the missing piece. After silently delivering her message, she never filed charges. There is one last thing worth mentioning about Lucy. She had great interest in herbal medicines and homemade recipes prepared from a medicine bush in the backyard. Years later, her curious grandson sent samples of this bush to a laboratory to see if it had real medicinal value. Perhaps he inherited the fascination with medicine from Lucy. This inheritance continued throughout his life and lasted until he created the world's leading medical research institute. After his 20s, William Avery Rockefeller was already a sworn enemy of conventional morality and had chosen a meaningless existence. Even as an adolescent, he would go on empty trips in the middle of winter, giving no clue as to his whereabouts. Throughout his life, he expended considerable energy on various illegal ways and schemes to avoid proper hard work. But he possessed such brazen charm and solid good looks that people were instantly captivated by his spell. He was nearly 6 feet tall, with a broad chest, high forehead, and a thick auburn beard covering a pugnacious jaw. This attractive exterior, at least for a while, calmed skeptics and disarmed critics. It was not surprising that this nomad did not accompany his family on their westward journey to Richford, but drifted into the area around 1835 in his own unique style. When he first appeared in a neighboring village, he immediately impressed the villagers with his strange style. Posing as a deaf-mute peddler selling cheap novelties, he had hung a slate with "I am deaf and dumb" written on it, tied to his buttonhole with a string, in a way everyone could see. On this slate he conversed with the locals and later boasted how he used this trick to flush out all the town's secrets. To win the confidence of strangers and soften them up for the hard sell, he carried a kaleidoscope and invited people to look at it. Throughout his long career as a confidence man, Big Bill always faced the risk of deception from people who might suddenly expose his frauds, and he barely escaped being caught at Deacon Wells's home. Deacon and his daughter, Mrs. Smith, pitied the poor peddler who knocked on their door one Saturday and sheltered him in their home that night. The next morning when they invited him to church, Big Bill had to resort to fancy footwork, because he always avoided crowds where there was a risk someone might recognize him and expose his fraud. A townsman tells, Billy told the deacon in writing that he loved going to church, but his disability caused people to stare at him, so he was embarrassed and wouldn't go. He was really afraid of being exposed as a fraud. 7 months later, after the deacon and Big Bill moved to Richford, Mrs. Smith saw the former deaf-mute at a social gathering and marveled at the miraculous recovery of his speech. "I see that you can talk better than when I saw you last," she said. Big Bill smiled unfazed, his audacity intact. "Yes, I'm somewhat improved." When he arrived in Richford, the locals immediately got a taste of his fraud, because he silently showed a slate with "Where is the house of Godfrey Rockefeller?" written on it. Since he usually presented false claims about himself and his products, Bill worked a large territory to evade the law. When he first met his future wife Eliza Davison at her father's farmhouse, he was roaming 30 miles northwest of Richford, in the vicinity of Niles and Moravia. With his flair for showmanship and self-promotion, he always wore brocaded vests or other brightly colored outfits, and these must have enchanted a sheltered farm girl like Eliza. Like many itinerant vendors in rural places, he was a smooth-talking purveyor of dreams along with cheap trinkets, and Eliza responded to this romantic wanderer. She was so impressed by his deaf and dumb humbug that she involuntarily exclaimed in his presence, "I would marry that man if he were not deaf and dumb." Whatever tacit doubt she carried when she discovered his deception, she soon surrendered to his mesmerizing charm like other women. Prudent, strict, a Baptist of Scotch-Irish descent and deeply attached to his daughter, John Davison must have sensed the troubles awaiting Eliza if she got mixed up with Big Bill Rockefeller and strongly discouraged this marriage. In later years, Eliza Rockefeller would look like a dried-up, withered old maid, but in late 1836 she was a slim, cheerful young woman with flame-red hair and blue eyes. Pious and self-contained, the exact opposite of Bill, and probably found him so hypnotic for just that reason. Who knows what gloom at the doorstep was dispelled by Bill's smooth talk? Her mother had died when Eliza was 12. She had collapsed and died after taking a pill given by a traveling doctor. And Eliza was raised by her older sister Mary Ann, which deprived Eliza of maternal counseling. On February 18, 1837, despite John Davison's open opposition, this most unlikely couple, Bill was 27, Eliza 24, were married at the home of one of Eliza's friends. The marriage was a favorite gossip item among the Richford townspeople, and they tended to smell guile on Bill's part. Compared to the Davisons, the Rockefellers were poor country folk, and it was very likely that Big Bill was entranced by reports of John Davison's modest wealth. As early as 1801, the frugal Davison had acquired 150 acres in Cayuga County. In John Dee's words, "My grandfather was a rich man." That is, for his time he was counted rich. In those days, one who had his farm paid for and had a little money beside was counted rich. 4, 5, or 6,000 was counted rich. My grandfather had perhaps 3 or 4 times that. He had money to lend. Most Richford residents believed that Big Bill's meeting with Eliza was less a random encounter than a premeditated move to capture her father's money. A notorious cad who regarded every pretty young woman as a potential conquest, Bill had at least one serious romance before wooing Eliza. As longtime Richford resident Ralph P. Smith recalled, "Billy was unmarried when he came here, and it was supposed that he would marry Nancy Brown, who was his housekeeper, but he broke with her. And when he decided to win the daughter of rich John Davison in Niles, it is said he settled a sum around $400 on her." The story is corroborated by John Dee's cousin, Mrs. John Wilcox. Nancy Brown from Harford Mills was a very beautiful girl, extremely beautiful. William fell in love with her. She was poor. William would have money. Eliza Davison's father would give her $500 when she married, so William married her. This marriage, consummated under false pretenses, fused the lives of two extremely dissimilar personalities and set the stage for all the future heartaches, marital discord, and chronic instability that would powerfully shape John D. Rockefeller's contradictory personality. When Bill brought his bride back to the house he had built in Richford, half a mile from his parents' place, Eliza must have pondered the wisdom of her father's disapproval. Life promised to be hard and merciless in this rough-hewn homestead. Surviving photos of John D. Rockefeller's birthplace show a plain wooden house placed on a treeless slope, bleakly outlined against the sky. The crude dwelling looked like 2 attached boxcars, the plain simplicity broken only by a small awning over one door. However primitive the exterior, the comfortable house was solidly built from timber taken from local forests. The main floor had 2 bedrooms and a living room, with a low sleeping attic and attic storage room above. The small attached building served as a barn and woodshed. This pastoral birthplace of the future kerosene king was probably lit by whale oil or tallow candles. The grounds were much more extensive than the house. The 50-acre lot included an apple orchard and a stretch of Owego Creek, bubbling and full of trout at the bottom of the property. Before long, Big Bill roughly disabused Eliza of any high-flying romantic notions she might have had about marriage. Far from giving up his girlfriend Nancy Brown, he brought her into the cramped house as a housekeeper and began having children alternately by wife and mistress. In 1838, Eliza gave birth to their first child, Lucy. A few months later, Nancy's first illegitimate daughter, Clorinda, was born. On the night of July 8, 1839, Bill and Eliza again summoned the midwife. This time to deliver a boy who came into the world in a bare front bedroom measuring 8 by 10 feet. This child, born during Martin Van Buren's presidency and destined to become the country's foremost capitalist, would survive into the second term of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Like many other future bosses, Andrew Carnegie, born in 1835, Jay Gould in 1836, and J. Pierpont Morgan in 1837, he too was born in the late 1830s, and would therefore come to maturity on the eve of the post-Civil War industrial boom. A few months after John's birth, Nancy Brown gave birth to a second girl, Cornelia, which meant that Bill, as lord of his own harem, had brought 4 children into the world under one roof in just 2 years. Thus the fiercely moralistic John Davison Rockefeller, appropriately named after Eliza's sober father, was sandwiched between 2 illegitimate sisters, born into a situation steeped in sin. Eliza could not have felt very comfortable with her in-laws. In general, the Rockefellers were a hard-drinking hillbilly clan, social and funny, fond of music, liquor, and loud good times, and adhering to a coarse frontier morality. As the strong matriarch, Lucy was the conspicuous exception, and Eliza drew close to her while frowning upon most of her more dissolute relatives. During the Richford period, Bill's younger brother, Miles Avery Rockefeller, deserted his wife and fled to South Dakota with Ella Broussais, a young woman who had done domestic work for Eliza. In a move that foreshadowed a future strategy for Bill, Miles entered into a second marriage with Ella and adopted his middle name as his new surname. Such recreated lives were common at a time when America had a vast unmapped frontier and numerous sanctuaries from the law. For a naive farm girl fresh from home, Eliza proved unexpectedly tolerant of Nancy Brown. Contrary to what might be expected, she pitied this uninvited guest, perhaps seeing the cramped ménage, à trois, as fit punishment for not heeding her father's advice. As her niece observed, Aunt Eliza loved her husband and she loved poor Nancy, but Aunt Eliza's brothers came and forced William to send Nancy away. During this period of Eliza's marriage, Mr. Davison is conspicuously absent. One wonders whether he had temporarily washed his hands of his disobedient daughter, or whether, crushed by guilt and shame, she had hidden her troubles from him. According to one account, when Nancy became quarrelsome after Bill's marriage, Bill used this opportunity to expel his shrewish mistress from the crowded household. Heeding the pleas from the Davisons, he sent Nancy and the 2 daughters to live with her family in nearby Harford Mills. Family legend claims that Bill, who had a weak but not entirely lifeless conscience, secretly left bundles of clothing on Nancy's doorstep. Fortunately, the years with Bill didn't blight Nancy's life, because she married a man named Burlingame, bore other children, and provided her first 2 daughters with a respectable upbringing. From the insufficient documentary evidence we know that Clorinda died young, while Cornelia grew up as a tall, smart, attractive teacher with a telling resemblance to Big Bill. Sometimes Bill yielded to her demands for money, but Bill's generosity had strict limits and he would rebuff her when she became too clamorous. Cornelia married a man named Sexton and remained in the Richford area, but only a few local residents and Rockefeller relatives knew she was John D.'s half-sister. To Cornelia's credit, she never tried to benefit from her kinship with the world's richest man, perhaps because this would unavoidably have advertised her illegitimacy. It was impossible to determine whether Rockefeller was aware of the existence of his 2 illegitimate half-sisters. The Nancy Brown affair was not the only indignity visited upon Eliza, for she was often abandoned by Bill during her 3 cheerless years in Richford. He remained a restless and defiant individualist who preferred a life beyond the pale of society. Early in the marriage, he stayed put for a while, operating a small lumber mill on Michigan Hill and dealing in salt, fur, horses, and timber. But he soon resumed the itinerant life of a peddler shrouded in unfathomable mystery. Like a fugitive, he would depart furtively under cover of night and return after dark, weeks or months later, throwing pebbles at the window to signal his return. To tide over his family in his absence, he arranged for credit at the market. He instructed Chauncey Rich, whose father Ezekiel had founded Richford, "Give my family anything they want while I'm away. I'll settle up when I return." Never knowing when this credit might be canceled, Eliza became extremely frugal, and instilled in her children thrifty maxims like "willful waste makes woeful want." When Bill returned home, a sudden smiling ghost, he would be riding new horses, wearing fine clothes, and brandishing a thick wad of crisp bills. Before going to see Eliza, he would pay off Chauncey Rich so he could confidently tell her everything at the market was settled. His seductive charm melted away whatever hostility his absence had aroused. It took time before his long absences and repeated betrayals burned the romance out of her system, leaving a residue of stoic resignation. At that moment, whatever her anxieties or loneliness, she seemed girlishly lovelorn during his trips, still smitten with her flim-flam man. Once when Bill was on the road, she sighed to a cousin, "Just look at that moon. Is William miles and miles away, perhaps looking at it now too? I hope so." On the road, Bill improvised ever more fantastic ways to make money. A crack shot, Bill made the circuit of shooting contests and often brought home prize money. A glad-handing huckster, he sold rings and other knickknacks at fantastic profit margins. But mostly he styled himself a botanic physician or herbal doctor, euphemisms faithfully repeated by some Rockefeller descendants. At a time when physicians still resorted to bleeding, blistering, and violent purgatives, and many rural areas lacked access to medical care, these traveling salesmen filled a vacuum. Nevertheless, in William Avery, Rockefeller, one clearly detects the blarney and easy conviviality of the charlatan. Sometimes he sold bottles of home-brewed elixir or over-the-counter medicines purchased from druggists, but he achieved his greatest success with natural medicines gathered from Lucy's medicine bush. Though his mother had a sincere interest in herbal remedies, Bill greatly distorted or exaggerated their properties. For example, he would gather small purplish berries from her garden that resembled small pills and hawk them to farmers' wives as a sovereign remedy for stomach troubles. His sales pitch went even further because, as a Richford neighbor reported years later, he would warn them solemnly that they must not be given to a woman in a delicate condition, for they would surely cause abortion. Whereupon he would sell his pills at a high price. They were perfectly harmless, and he broke no law in selling them. He had a remarkable imagination. William Rockefeller's midnight rambles and peculiar commerce mystified the Richford citizenry. It both fired and troubled the imagination, generating so much gossip and speculation that they christened him Devil Bill. Rumors that he was a gambler, a horse thief, a desperado periodically raced through town. Though he seemed to operate on the edge of the law, people were pleased by his brash humor and tall tales, if dismayed by his treatment of his family. A Richford townsman said, "When he finally succeeded as a peddler, he would dress up like a prince and kept everyone wondering. He laughed a great deal and enjoyed the speculation he caused. He was not a drinking man and treated his family well when he was home, but everyone knew that he neglected them by leaving them to shift for themselves for long months at a time. He frustrated those neighbors who ached for his comeuppance. After one prolonged absence of several months, when Eliza's bill at Chauncey Rich's topped $1,000, rumors said that Devil Bill had been arrested. Instead, he came riding into town like a country squire in a magnificent carriage, seated behind a team of splendid horses, diamonds glittering in his shirt front. At the market, he made a point of paying the tab with large bills. After such trips, Bill gathered friends and family around the dinner table, and while wolfing down heaps of food, would regale them with picaresque tales of his adventures among the western settlers and Indians. Devil Bill had the ability to transform his experiences into spellbinding narratives and made Eliza and the children vicarious partners in his travels. The chief casualty of Bill's wanderings, Eliza received sympathy from her neighbors, who felt she was being abused by her husband. Yet she remained loyal to him, declined opportunities to denigrate him, and carried herself with considerable dignity. Though frequent biographical claims about John D. Rockefeller's impoverished childhood have been exaggerated, several people testified to the family's squalor in Richford. One neighbor observed, "I do not remember ever to have seen more pitiably neglected children. Their clothing was old and tattered, and they looked dirty and hungry." A measure of Eliza's desperation was seeking relief in the home of her brother-in-law, Jacob Rockefeller, a bawdy, jolly man who was not infrequently drunk. An oft-told tale about Jacob recounted how he won a $5 bet by staying sober during an entire trip to town. Jacob's kindly wife became a second mother to the two small children, Lucy and John, mending their clothes and knitting them mittens from woolen homespun. In this nightmare situation, Eliza seemed to draw strength from adversity. A Richford native praised her. "A most excellent woman, but one who bore too heavy a burden at that time to properly look after her children. Her husband was away for long periods, and she had to look after their 60-acre farm and try to make it pay their expenses. She did not know at what time the shopkeepers of the village might shut down on her credit, and she worked very hard." When John D. later evoked his sunny, peaceful childhood in upstate New York, he erased Richford from these reveries. He was only 3 when he left there, with only a few hazy memories of the place. "I remember very clearly the brook that ran in front of the house and how careful I had to be to stay far away from it. I vaguely remember my mother in Richford and my grandmother who lived half a mile or so up the hill." Note that Rockefeller's earliest memory was associated with caution, and he edited out the absent father and drunken grandfather, but kept the strong, enduring mother and grandmother. He always possessed an unusual self-protective capacity to suppress unpleasant memories and keep alive those things that strengthened his resolve. As far as we can tell, Rockefeller knew nothing about Nancy Brown and the seamy side of Richford existence, but he carried through life a vague sense of an infernal place. He later confessed, "I shudder to think of what I would have become if I had remained in Richford all my life. There were many men who hunt a little, fish a little, and drink a little whiskey, and only attain a little success in life, and all for lack of a little religion." Regarding his family's decision to leave Richford, Rockefeller offered an economic explanation that probably served as the standard cover story of his childhood: stingy soil. Rockefeller would say, "The country there is beautiful, but the settlers wasted their energy trying to get the stumps out of the ground and trying to make crops grow in the poor soil." The real reason, of course, was Eliza's horror at the town's low moral tone, as reflected by its single church. She probably also wanted to remove the children from the influence of her boisterous, drunken Rockefeller in-laws and expose them to the steadier Davisons. No coincidence the Rockefellers moved to Moravia, 3 miles from the Davison farm, where Eliza could enjoy her father's presence during her husband's habitual absences. Now listen to me. I didn't tell you this story just so you would learn the past. I told it to show you what power is, how character is built. John D. Rockefeller was born in the midst of chaos. He was born into betrayal. He came into the world as the son of a con man and was sandwiched between two illegitimate sisters. But what did he do? He didn't complain. He didn't assume the role of victim. He didn't use his roots as an excuse. No. He learned lessons from the chaos he lived through. He saw his grandfather Godfrey's weakness and swore never to be like him. He saw his father Devil Bill's deceptions and learned something about honesty. He saw his mother Eliza's resilience and learned something about discipline. He saw his grandmother Lucy's courage and learned something about willpower. This is it. This is where you're missing it. You look at your roots and see them as fate. But roots are not fate. Roots are raw material. You decide what to build from them. Now let me ask you something. What is your chaos? What is your failure? What is your shame? And how are you using it? Because the world's richest man is teaching you this. Where you come from doesn't matter. What matters is where you decide to go. This is not a coincidence. This is a choice. And you need to make this choice now. Never knowing when this credit might be canceled, Eliza was extremely thrifty and engraved frugal maxims like willful waste makes woeful want into her children. When Bill returned home, he would suddenly appear with a smile on his face, riding new horses, wearing stylish clothes, and waving a thick wad of crisp banknotes in his hand. He would pay off Chauncey Rich before seeing Eliza, so he could confidently tell her that everything was settled at the store. His seductive charm melted the anger accumulated by his absence. But the long separations and repeated betrayals took time until they gradually extinguished the romance, leaving behind only stoic acceptance. For now, whatever her anxieties or loneliness, she appeared girlishly in love on his travels, still smitten with her con man. When Bill was on the road, she once sighed to a cousin, "Look at that moon. Is William, who is miles away, perhaps looking at it right now? I hope so." While on the road, Bill developed increasingly strange and imaginative methods to make money. A crack shot, he made the circuit of shooting competitions, usually bringing home prize money. As a cheerful salesman, he sold rings and other trinkets, accompanied by exaggerated and imaginatively embellished stories. Most often, he fashioned himself as a botanic physician or herbal doctor, euphemisms faithfully repeated by some Rockefeller grandchildren. In an era when doctors still resorted to bloodletting, blistering, and harsh laxatives, and many rural areas had no access to medical care, such traveling vendors filled an important gap. Nevertheless, the quack's blather and easy affability could clearly be detected in William Avery Rockefeller. From time to time, he sold bottles of homemade elixirs or patent medicines obtained from pharmacies, but he achieved his greatest success with natural healing mixtures collected from Lucy's physic bush. While his mother had a genuine interest in herbal medicines, Bill greatly distorted or exaggerated their properties. For example, he would collect purple berry-like fruits from her garden and present them to farm women as an effective remedy for stomach ailments. His sales pitch went even further. As a Richford neighbor reported years later, he would seriously warn that they should not be given to a woman in a delicate condition, as they would certainly cause miscarriage. He would then sell these pills at quite a high price. They were completely harmless, and he violated no law by selling them. He had an extraordinarily powerful imagination. William Rockefeller's midnight wanderings and strange trade astonished Richford citizens. It both fired the imagination and disturbed, producing so much gossip and speculation that they gave him the name Devil Bill. From time to time, rumors circulated in the town that he was a gambler, a horse thief, or a bandit. Although he seemed to operate on the edge of the law, people were pleased with his brash humor and long stories, even though they were uncomfortable with his treatment of his family. One townsperson joining this game of speculating about Bill's various sources of income said, "When he finally achieved success in peddling, he began to dress like a prince and left everyone wondering. He laughed a lot and enjoyed the speculation he caused. He wasn't a drinker and treated his family well when he was home, but everyone knew he neglected them by leaving them to their own devices for months." After an absence lasting several months, when Eliza's bill at Chauncey Rich exceeded $1,000, gossip said that Devil Bill had been arrested. Instead, with the air of a country gentleman, he would enter town in a magnificent carriage, sitting behind splendid horses, diamonds sparkling on his shirt front. At the general store, he made the point of settling the account with great bills. After such journeys, Bill would gather friends and family around the dinner table. While plenty of food was eaten, he would recount in picaresque style his adventures with Western settlers and Indians. Devil Bill had the ability to weave his experiences into fascinating narratives, making Eliza and the children indirect partners in his travels. Eliza, the main victim of Bill's journeys, received sympathy from her neighbors. Most thought she was being mistreated by her husband, yet she remained loyal to him, refused many opportunities to badmouth him, and carried herself with significant dignity. Despite the often exaggerated biographical narratives about John D. Rockefeller's impoverished childhood, few witnessed the family in Richford living in real destitution. A neighbor observed, "I don't remember seeing children more pitifully neglected. Their clothes were old and torn, and they looked dirty and hungry." An indication of Eliza's desperation was seeking solace in the house of her brother-in-law, Jacob Rockefeller, who was known for his obscenity and cheerfulness and was rarely seen sober. A frequently told story about Jacob recounts how he won a $5 bet by staying sober throughout an entire tour of the town. Jacob's compassionate wife became like a second mother to two young children, Lucy and John. She mended their clothes and knitted them gloves from homespun wool. In this nightmare situation, Eliza seemed to draw strength from adversity. A Richford resident described her. "She was a perfect woman, but in that period she couldn't care for her children properly because of the heavy burden on her shoulders. Her husband was absent for long periods, and she had to tend to their 60-acre farm and try to make their expenses pay. She didn't know when she could settle the debts to the village shops, but she worked constantly." When John D. later recalled his sunny, idyllic childhood in upstate New York, he erased Richford from these dreams. He was only 3 years old when he left there, and only a few faint memories of the place remained in his mind. "I remember very clearly the stream that passed in front of the house and how careful I had to be to stay away from it. I vaguely remember our mother in Richford and our grandmother living about half a mile up the hill." We see that Rockefeller's earliest memories show remarkable selectivity, pushing father with his absence and disorderliness and drunken grandfather into the background, while preserving the memory of the strong and enduring mother and grandmother. He always had an unusual self-protective capacity to suppress unpleasant memories, while always keeping vivid those that strengthened his determination. As far as we understand, Rockefeller was unaware of Nancy Brown and that miserable life in Richford, but throughout his life he carried a vague, hell-like feeling he couldn't shake. "Thinking about what would have become of me if I had stayed in Richford all my life makes me shudder," he later confessed. "There were many men who did a little hunting, a little fishing, a little whiskey drinking, who could only achieve small success in life, and the reason was often a lack of religion." About the decision for his family to leave Richford, Rockefeller probably offered an economic explanation that served as the standard cover story of his childhood. Meager soil,